Welcome everyone for joining us. Good morning or evening, wherever you are. It's middle of the afternoon for me. And I'll say more about where our guest panelists are in a moment. As you can see, the clicker will be expanding as we see in every webinar for the first 5 minutes. But we'll get started, and for some reason after 2 years, people have not allowed 5-minute breaks between Zoom meetings. So my name is Brian Golden. I'm the Sandra Rotman Chair in Health Sector Strategy at the Rotman School, Professor of Strategic Management, and the Academic Director for the Sandra Rotman Center for Health Sector Strategy at the Rotman School. The Sandra Rotman Center is very happy to host today's event, and thank you for all tuning into the live stream. One of the silver linings of the way we're delivering these webinars these days is that we're able to have a much more global panel as well as a global list of attendees. Let me start off by saying that although this event is taking place virtually, we always would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Zeneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, while we're meeting virtually, Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So let me welcome our panel this morning, or this evening, a discussion about the learning from COVID vaccine development, production, and distribution. Now, we all know you have attended various webinars over the last year, starting off with learnings from, and this promises, I know, to be a very distinct hour because of both our focus and our unique set of panelists. The focus really is how we can build on the lessons learned, what's essential for success, and what do we need to avoid, importantly. And interestingly, I think, how do we build trust going forward? This is a global panel. In fact, no one is in Toronto. I'm in the surreal place of Copenhagen right now, where we're presenting, I think, an image of what the world might look like down the road. There are no restrictions at all here. And as I was joking to the panel as we got started, there are many who are in trucks right now across Canada who would love this environment. But of course, they can't get here because they would need to be vaccinated to fly. Then we've got Ayman Chit. He is head of medical international, the international region for Sanofi Pasteur, based in Lyon. Dube, Director of Global Oncology Policy Precision Medicine at AstraZeneca and based in Washington, D.C. Mark Feinberg, the CEO of IAVI, which is the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, and joining us from Philadelphia. And then Derrick, Director of Vaccine Supply and Demand at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and who leads the COVAX facilities deals and transactions team in London, who just flew in this morning from Copenhagen. So truly a global panel. Before we get started, just as a reminder, today is the final session of our seminar series, Learning from COVID-19, and particularly leadership from the private sector. Each event in the series explores lessons from our experience with COVID related to the role of management, specifically collaboration, integration, partnerships, and the private sector. The seminar is sponsored is one of the many events from the Sandra Rotman Center. Our center has 3 main areas of focus: research and thought leadership, educational program for emerging and senior healthcare leaders, and lastly, outreach such as this one to encourage dialogue and learning of topics related to management and healthcare delivery. And then lastly, before we dig in, one of our newest programs at the center is our Global Executive MBA for Healthcare and the Life Sciences, which is designed for working professionals in both public and private sector, with our mid-career professionals coming from across the globe. We study in Toronto, Singapore, the UK, and the Bay Area. Okay, So let's jump right in. I'll be asking a series of questions to our panelists, and we hope there will be time remaining for questions that we'll be monitoring in the chat. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and my colleague Rosemary Hannum will be monitoring those along with me. So let's start off with our first question, and maybe I'll direct it first at Ayman, and then open it up to the rest of the panel. And that question is, we, and I mean you and others, were able to develop an effective vaccine, in fact, more than one, in record time. And if you could share with us your insights, the panel's insights around the success of that, how we were able to accomplish that, and what lessons can we take going forward for the next time we face a similar world. Ayman, please.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, and thanks for the invite. Thank you all for taking the time to attend the series. I think it's important that people discuss these issues intimately and learn from them. It's pretty historic what's going on in the world right now. It might feel like some of it is common moment, but 5-10 years from now, when we reflect back on this, when history reflects back on this, it's really remarkable what happened. Vaccines is another part of this story that's pretty remarkable. In fact, when we got a little bit lucky, I would say, and then also we were a little bit blessed. We got lucky in the sense that the COVID, the virus itself, though it's an RNA virus, it's not one of the most rapidly mutating ones. Also had some nice features for vaccine design. So it had a unique spike protein that was pretty distinct and on the cell surface that was really driving the functionality of how this virus worked. So that's sort of great if you're designing vaccines. You look for these things on the cell surface because it's kind of a target to block. If you block it successfully, you impede the virus. So we got lucky a little bit with this virus that it had some of these features that a very functional protein was very distinct on the surface. The other thing we got lucky with, and maybe a little bit blessed with, is the plethora of technologies that were available to us. Chief amongst which is the DNA-based technologies, mRNA, and the viral vector technologies. These have not been used in vaccines in the past, but they've been studied for a long time. And there was major revelations in their development that happened around the 2016-17 timeframe that made them very usable very quickly. So if this pandemic had happened in 2015, these technologies may not have been ready. And we would have been working with the more traditional technologies that were available, which actually were used in China, for instance, by some of the Chinese manufacturers and some of these mid-range technologies that were used. Our company has one, Novavax, another company that's been using them. But really, the real blessing has been these genetic-based technologies. They were just ready. And in fact, we talk about the first vaccine design, it was done over a weekend. So when the first sequence of the Wuhan strain was made available, it was actually a Chinese scientist who flew over to Australia and posted the sequencing code of the virus. Over the weekend, the genetic-based technology companies had already created a blueprint for the vaccine. Remarkable. So vaccine in a weekend designed. And then the thing was, because mRNA is a bit easier to work with and scale up, we had vaccine test batches available very quickly after that. And with the fury of the pandemic and the transmission rate of the virus, we were able to go into testing right away in the field. And luckily for everybody, there was no spectacular safety events with this thing. So safety data came back clean. As people were vaccinated, there was no immediate problems. The formulations that were chosen during development seemed to be not far off. So there was not a lot of investigation around dose responses, which is, again, there's a bit of element of luck there. There's some element of design, but there's an element of luck there. So we maybe caught a bit of a break. The major technologies worked, and they worked really quickly. And we had a vaccine in about a year. if you asked me at the beginning of the pandemic, even with all of that, I was telling people we were not going to see a vaccine for 2-3 years in the best case, but we got a vaccine in a year. So it exceeded the expectations of the experts. You know, the last thing I'll say before turning it over is that what I didn't mention yet is the efficacy profile of the vaccine. Despite the mutations that this virus has gone through, because it is an RNA virus, it mutates. It's not as fast mutating as flu, but it's not a nil mutation. Yeah, it mutates at a substantial rate. Despite the mutation rate of this virus, okay, until today, the vaccines designed on the original DNA sequences of this virus are still highly effective against serious complications of the disease, including hospitalizations and death. And that is spectacular. We are seeing the virus overcome the full sterilizing immunity. So it's like, you know, you may see some symptoms now if you're infected and vaccinated, right? But really, there are very few people who are infected and vaccinated that are getting into real health trouble. And that is pretty spectacular. And that's sort of something that is a real miracle of science, if you ask me. So I'll stop there, Brian.
Great. So Ayman, thank you for that. And now that more people have had the opportunity to enter the chat, and now that I'm more carefully reading my prepared notes, I realize I neglected to put all of you in proper context in your organization. So maybe, Ayman, if you could start off with the group, explaining your role in the company. I think that context is important. And then as we go to our other panelists, I can ask each of them to spend a couple of minutes explaining your role and where you're situated.
Yes, so I work for Sanofi Vaccines, and we're a global multinational company focused on the development of vaccine technologies, amongst other medicines. I focus on vaccines. My whole career has been in that. And I sit in the medical department, which is a department that supports the development and distribution of vaccines all over the world. My team is spread across the world, and there are groups of physicians and scientists that work in the areas I just mentioned.
Great, thank you for that. And Mark, we'll pass it over to you, and if you can situate yourself and your organization, and then your thoughts on our effectiveness in developing the vaccine.
No, thanks very much, Brian. I'm Mark Feinberg. I'm the CEO of a not-for-profit research and development organization, IAVI, that focuses on developing vaccines and biologics to meet the needs of people living in low-income countries. My background is a physician scientist who's worked in academia, government, and industry. So I have perspectives on these issues from those different vantage points, and that sort of drives my interest in finding ways to have the most effective partnerships between different sectors and different organizations, which is very relevant to today's discussion. I just wanted to add a little bit more elaboration to what Ayman indicated, which I agree with. One important lesson for people to appreciate is that while SARS-CoV-2 is a really terrible virus in terms of the toll it's inflicted on humanity, it's actually a very easy vaccine target. So I think one mistake people might make if we're looking for lessons learned from the COVID vaccine development effort, that if a new pathogen, or I should say when a new pathogen emerges, that we will be able to repeat or beat this timeline for vaccine development. And I think that's probably more unlikely than likely. If it's a more difficult target, it would take longer to develop an efficacious vaccine. I just wanted to add a couple of perspectives. One is what happened before and how that enabled the rapid response to the COVID pandemic in terms of vaccine development. One is the technologies that Ayman alluded to. There have been tremendous investments in different areas, including, I think, in particular, HIV vaccine development that drove vaccine technology to a new state. And as Ayman said, it was kind of a fortunate coincidence that those insights were available when the COVID pandemic emerged. The other point I would like to make is that, while we're far from perfect, and hopefully we'll get closer to a good model moving forward, there had been a lot of efforts emerging from other pandemic threats, including the 2009 avian influenza pandemic, the West African Ebola outbreak in 2014 to 2016. And it gave rise to a number of new organizations like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, with the recognition that we need to prepare for threats rather than just respond to them. And I think progress was made on advancing multi-sector collaborations, but we've seen that there's so much more work that needs to be done if we're really going to have them be as effective and powerful and efficient and proactive as we need them to be in the future.
Thanks for that. And Derrick, I wish you were, I wish all my students were as great as you, raising your hand, so thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Hello, everyone, and I'm pleased to be here. So Derrick Sim, I'm the Director of Vaccine Supply and Demand at Gavi, which is a non-profit organization headquartered here in Geneva, which looks at helping the developing countries and at least developed countries access a range of vaccines for their regular immunization programs. And in the COVID pandemic, we've broadened to ensure global access and equitable access for the COVID-19 vaccines. And in the COVAX facility, I lead our deals and transactions team to contract with manufacturers for those vaccines. I've had a history in vaccines and vaccination, having worked in the private sector, as well as a co-investigator on certain phase 3 studies earlier on in my career as a medical doctor. I think one of the things to realize, just building on what Ayman and Mark talked about, is that we have seen an unprecedented number of new vaccine players and biotechs enter this space, and have been, remarkably successful as well for the reasons that Mark has talked about. One of the things that we recognize is that while vaccine development is important, it is just the first step. And ultimately, we want to ensure that vaccines can actually reach, to the people and communities that we want. And I think just on the development side, I think one of the lessons that will be learned from this, particularly for the new players and biotechs, is that the regulatory processes can actually be reasonably complex. And even as we're talking about accelerated or conditional approval processes, these are exceptional processes which manufacturers and developers, I think, need to be very attuned to. One of the things that we have been advocating for, and I think can do better, is that in future, we would like to see manufacturers and developers seek WHO guidance much sooner on the regulatory pathways to ensure that the vaccines can be used across the world, and particularly in the least developed countries. I think manufacturers were often quite quick in consulting with the stringent regulatory authorities, such as the US FDA or Health Canada, for instance, or the European Medicines Agencies, but perhaps not as quick in talking to WHO. And I think that's one thing that we would like to encourage. I think the second thing that they need to then think about is actually the regulatory aspects of the supply sites and manufacturing sites that will supply the vaccines. So even though we did see the vaccines get their first approvals, one of the things that did contribute to a level of delay was then the qualification and the approval of specific vaccination production sites. And again, particularly when a developer or manufacturer has a global ambition, it does require a larger network of manufacturing sites, and actually paying attention to where those networks will supply, particularly the developing countries and the lower developed countries, is important, so that once again, the necessary approvals and accreditations by WHO and others can be obtained as soon as possible.
Derrick, that is just a beautiful transition, I think, to France. Particularly, one question that had come in, and you've alluded to it, but I want to turn it over to France again to situate yourself in your role in AstraZeneca, but then perhaps talk about the regulatory environment. Derrick has referred to other manufacturers outside, maybe what we might think of as more traditional manufacturing bases. And as a lead in policy at AstraZeneca, your perspective would be fantastically valuable to us.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for the invite to participate today. I'm very happy to be here. And so I'm Dube. There's actually an accent on the E.
I got
That's okay. And so it may be confusing when you announce my role, because I moved to this role in December, but prior to that, born and bred in Canada, and I was leading the efforts around vaccine, COVID, or AstraZeneca. Of course, I work with AstraZeneca. Our COVID vaccine approval and procurement in Canada. So my view will be from that perspective in terms of bringing it to market. In terms of AstraZeneca, and Derrick, you would know this, that we have we're one of the first companies to actually partner with CEPI, Gavi, and COVAX. And so I think that partnership is probably, with an S, partnerships is critical in this space. I think prior to the pandemic, probably people weren't that familiar with AstraZeneca, but they certainly are now. And I think that obviously the partnership with Oxford University was critical. So that was the first part. And then to Derrick's point around the distribution. So, on the regulatory side, I would say what started for us as a manufacturer was around the advanced purchase agreement. So there's the EPAs that we needed to sign with the government. That's lengthy. That takes a lot of back and forth. That takes their legal people, our legal people, and it kind of, and so multiply that. And then on the regulatory side is the regulatory approval. And so there's significant submissions that you have to put together. They're different, some differ across the countries, and so multiply that in terms of what's required to be provided to Health Canada, for example, as Derrick highlighted. So, in terms of some of the lessons learned, it would be great from a centralization perspective through the WHO to be able to have some of those consistencies. And so in a pandemic, you have to react very quickly. And so that just helps to alleviate some of the, the pressures. We saw it very, there's political, there's research, there's, at the end of the day, we're all humans, and there's going to be a human aspect that comes in. But I think going through a centralized body like WHO is really helpful, would be very helpful in the future to continue to do that. I mean, we've done really well through that partnership, and I think right now we've gotten over 2.6 billion doses of the vaccine distributed. So it's being distributed globally in many countries. So that's something to be proud of. But obviously, there's more work to be done, and I think some of the key learnings from this are going to be critical.
Great. And Franz, thank you for that. Before we transition to my next question, let me just circle back to Ayman. It was your comments that prompted the question that came in around regulatory. So from a Sanofi Pasteur perspective, anything you'd like to add about the regulatory process and interaction around drug development teams?
Yeah, my feeling is that the discussion may be marginal because we got a vaccine in a year. Now, what concerns me is actually outside of the regulatory. We're very perplexed about the inequity of access globally. So WHO is known to have a bit of a lighter regulatory process. The FDA, Health Canada, European agencies have a more complex regulatory environment. Yet, these countries that have the more complex process seem to have all the vaccines. I think the immunization rates in Africa really are pretty disturbing in relative terms. So that's my feeling about the regulatory process. I'm not saying it doesn't need work, but it may be marginal. And I'm not so sure it explains the sharp inequity in access globally. And certainly the vaccine did emerge in a year. I'm not so sure, I mean, it may have slowed it down a little bit, but it's way ahead of schedule. So just offering a little bit of a more different perspective than some other comments, but that's just my feelings on this.
So that is really helpful, and I think makes for a nice transition point to the observation around production, and obviously development, production, distribution. You know, we've separated these out in the title of this panel, but of course they're all interrelated. Let me put this question. Maybe I'll start off with Derrick and then move to Mark and then ask others to join in around the notion or the observation that production of vaccine is complicated, it's challenging, and as a consequence, some countries had their own production facilities, and some, like Canada, had to rely on vaccines produced elsewhere. So your perspective, maybe again, to start with Derrick, what role did this play with respect to access, and what did we learn?
It's a big topic, Brian, and I think an important one, actually. So firstly, I think we should recognize that vaccines and biological production is more complex than producing the so-called white pills and pharmaceuticals. And that is one of the reasons why the production of biologics and vaccines are relatively concentrated in a number of countries around the world. And as you noted, Brian, you know, Canada doesn't have any sizable biologics or vaccine manufacturing, and likewise, even if we look at Europe, it is concentrated in relatively few places. I think that is part of the reality of the current technology. Is not to say that in future, as people try to develop other types of vaccines and vaccine platforms, perhaps that may change. Having said that, I think in this pandemic, that was the starting point. We do know that many of the existing vaccine facilities actually had the potential to scale. And also had the potential to perhaps cater for the volumes that were needed globally. I think one of the things at the beginning of the pandemic was a scramble for doses. And there were a couple of levers. Certainly, as Franz mentioned, advanced purchase agreements were put in by certain national governments way ahead of time. I think Ayman touched on equity, and equity is extremely important. It is, developing countries and the majority of countries around the world just do not have the financial capacity to take on those advanced commitments. It is not just the quantum and the amount of money that's needed, it is the risk that is needed, because these vaccines were still in development. There was no guarantee that they would actually succeed. And yet the contracts that would be putting in place required a bet. And that is at the heart of the matter, is how do we ensure that countries that have lower resources and lower ability to take on that sort of risk are able to get equitable access. So that is one of the reasons why the COVAX facility, which I represent, was stood up, so that we could, on behalf of these countries, work with manufacturers and contract with manufacturers at risk for vaccines. And I'm pleased to say that as of January this year, we have shipped over 1 billion doses of vaccine within 12 months to over 140 countries around the world, which has taken a massive effort from not just us and our partners, but manufacturers and countries and others involved. The second point of leverage, I think, was that in addition to contracts, we did see some bad behavior, I think, on some national governments or regions, which effectively nationalized those scarce facilities, which effectively meant that the territories on where those factories were located had to be served first. Now, this, I think, sort of worsened the equity aspect and the global availability of vaccines. I think the learning coming out of it is how can we use a multilateral system and a much fairer sense of play amongst all the stakeholders next time round to recognize that, manufacturing these biologicals and vaccines is difficult, and therefore, there is a kind of responsibility to ensure that where such capacity and know-how exists, there is a sort of responsibility and indeed an obligation to ensure that the intellectual capacity, the know-how is shared more equitably around the world, and that would include ensuring fairer and timely access. And I think Ayman referred to that. It's the time factor that is critical here.
Derrick, you're absolutely right. We could talk a long time about this issue. And let me pass it over to Mark, because I know, Mark, you have a lot to say about this.
Well, again, it is, as you and Derrick said, it's a complicated thing that we could talk about for a very long time, and I'm sure we will be talking about for a very long time. And I mean, I think the issue of nationalism that Derrick raised is a very important one, because what the pandemic hopefully will teach everyone is that access is in everyone's best interest, and for us all to be protected, everyone on the planet needs to be vaccinated with an efficacious vaccine. We see the continued emergence of viral variants, and that will likely continue for a long time until we have a better sort of population level immunity, and hopefully that's engendered by vaccination. The topic that you had raised, Brian, about manufacturing capacity in different countries, I think there's been this view on some people's part that every country needs its own manufacturing capability, and that is like the solution to access. And I don't actually agree with that. I think the discussion has in many ways become much more political than practical, and I would rather have us think what is necessary from a practical point of view in terms of product quality, product scale, the predictability of supply, and the affordability and product profile that's necessary to maximize timely access. And that doesn't necessarily mean having different facilities in multiple countries making different vaccines. That gets to be both chaotic and more likely to actually not get the job done. I do think, and I don't know exactly the answer to this, but I do think one important lesson coming out of this would be a dialogue among knowledgeable stakeholders about what can we do together to enable faster, more reliable, more equitable supply of vaccines in the future. And I don't think that the answer will be manufacturing facilities in every country. It'll just need to be a much greater degree of positive, trusting collaboration between different countries and normative agencies, like the WHO, organizations like Gavi, et cetera.
Okay. So let me pivot a little bit off that, and Ayman and Franz, I don't mean to stand you up as the voice of the private sector here, but you are our private sector representatives, and your organization's perspective on this around the centralization where production occurs. Maybe Ayman, if I can kick it over to you first.
Sure, yeah. No, and it's I like how Mark characterized it. And actually, Derrick, you said it too. You said it's really hard to make these things. They're not like the white pills. That's true. There's something magical about, like, if you change the container from being cubical in nature to being spherical in nature, all of a sudden you stop passing your assays. Nobody knows why, So there's a bit of a black box thing, and that's why some of the regulations are the way they are, because you get into these black box situations, and then these people throw up their hands and say, well, you know what, you need to pass this type of test, and the type of test tends to be stringent so that we can pass you on to the next level. And the more of those that you have, and all of a sudden you have a very complex and intricate thing. And in fact, I'll tell the audience one more thing about this, is that tech transfers in biologics are extremely difficult. We have an experience doing them in Brazil. It took us 10 years to transfer production of influenza vaccine and eggs to the Brazilians. We partnered 10 years, you know, and we sent them the trivalent version. They're trying to scale up by themselves to the quadrivalent, and it's been about 4 years them trying to do that by themselves. You know, it is remarkably complicated to build. Now, with the new genetic technologies, I think there may be some form of simplifications because you're working with less protein. Protein is very difficult to work with. So that may be a bit of hope. Now, the other thing I will say is that even if the production process simplifies, I don't know. We don't feel at my company, at least, that if we had more factories in different parts of the world, that we would be able to do much better. You know, we conducted a few studies recently over the past few years, actually, just before the pandemic and during the pandemic, to try and see what are the forces that boost the number of innovative projects. So make us make better, newer vaccines for specific diseases. And we looked at all of the research done on cause and effect of these, of pumping up the number of R&D projects studied out of the US, and you see sort of the effect of push and pull mechanisms. So what stands out from that research is that there is a remarkable effect of pull mechanisms. And we saw two very big pull mechanisms during the pandemic. So pull mechanisms are things where you guarantee a market. Push mechanisms are things where you subsidize R&D or development. So the big two pull mechanisms, so you can think about Operation Warp Speed. It had a push and a pull. They said, we'll pay for your development and we'll buy the stuff. You know, I think the CEO of Pfizer says, you know what, don't pay for my development, just buy the stuff, because he wanted to work faster. So he immediately abandoned just naturally the push mechanism. He just took the pull one. And then COVAX is a remarkable example of a very strong pull mechanism. It says, you just said it, Derrick, right? These small markets struggle to organize, they struggle to come up with the funds to overcome the risk and all the other issues that they have. And you folks really bridge that market, the gap for them, you know? And in fact, I think without a COVAX, the inequity in the world would be much worse. So I think there may be more, like, you know, maybe if we had COVAX earlier, maybe if COVAX was even more funded by the philanthropists of the world, maybe if there was a better focus on pull mechanisms to say, you know what, the United States won't pay more. The Gulf states won't pay more. We'll make sure that we have an equitable force that draws the product out around the world. So that's a little bit of thinking. I mean, look, we don't have a firm position on any of this, but we've been like doing a lot of thinking. It's a very, very hard problem, you know. I'll stop there. I could go on, but I'll stop there, right? I'll let Franz talk a little bit.
So Franz, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to expand the question, and then I think we're going to get into some controversial issues, if we haven't already. But Franz, your perspective on this question, as well as I'm thinking about the prep conversation we all had last week, and how, you know, part of this challenge is government leaders are elected by their people, their citizens, not the world's citizens. And we have to help them, if we want to, have a conversation with their constituents, their voters, about how serving the rest of the world is in our interest. So if you could speak to that, as well as anything else that's kicking around your head from the most recent questions. But let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. That's a tough one. You know, it's the political minefields that are, that if we just look at the experience so far in terms of the pandemic and some of the experiences, I think Mark highlighted a few of them. And that's where you know, when you think about WHO and Gavi and COVAX and their role and where they are, there's the potential that it could de-escalate some of that, you know, in terms of the political I don't know if I call them games, but there's political, there's a lot of tension. There's been a lot of tension. And to your point, the politicians are human and they're serving their population. So, put yourself in the the middle of last year, the year before, deaths, people are dying, like their citizens are dying. So it's causing a lot of tension, it's causing a lot of pressure, so it's understandable. So how can you help that, especially during a pandemic? Because there's hysteria, there's, people are obviously, for a good reason, frightened about what the future is and what's happening. So if you think about that pandemic area, I think the centralization, I think learning from this, is there a way to continue to make it live, like COVAX and the facilities and WHO, like how do you make that sustainable so that, everybody's saying there's going to be another one. We're still in this one. We're still waiting to get out of this one, but there's going to be another one. And so how do we make sure that, the private sector continues to be a strong partner along with the public sector? And it's critical. And you said it at the beginning, how do you build trust? That's critical. And I think you need to bring the people around the table to be able to have some really good discussions around that, so that everybody's aligned in terms of the way forward. Because I think if we don't bring the people to the table, it's really hard to establish that trust, I think, moving forward.
So thanks for that. I'm reflecting on how difficult it is to have adult conversations when your house is on fire, and thinking about the future. But clearly part of this is setting up the infrastructure and the governance mechanisms for the next time. And Mark and Derrick, your organizations are critical to that, and we will have a next time. And Mark, your organization has clearly evolved over time. So maybe turn it over to you, Mark, for your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I think it's an important question, and I do think we're learning from these experiences, and it's incumbent upon us to really ask that question in detail and work to find answers. A lot of organizations, especially those in the public sector and the private sector, historically don't necessarily understand each other's realities all that well, or others' intentions all that well. So sometimes they misinterpret them in terms of what an organization is able to do and capable of doing. And I think going back to the issue of trust, there's often mistrust between the different sectors, and that's something that I think is in no one's best interest, and we need to find ways of doing better in that regard. I mean, my organization, just like Derrick and a number of others here, is predicated on the idea that you do things through collaborations, that no one organization is actually able to do the job by themselves, especially when you're dealing with a complicated global health threat. So figuring out what we refer to as kind of the science of partnerships, I think it is a discipline that we need to really develop and think seriously about as it relates to preparing for and responding to pandemic threats. Having been in the private sector working for Merck, the multinational pharmaceutical company, and now working for a not-for-profit organization, I've seen firsthand how there are missed opportunities for collaboration and impact. And if organizations could just come together in an environment where you could actually share perspectives in a solutions-oriented way, I think there's a lot more that can be done. And I'm not saying that as like some, unconstrained optimist. I think there's practical benefits there to each sector, and we just need to work through that. I mean, obviously, doing that in the middle of this pandemic, I think, is difficult, but I do think that we need to prioritize an understanding of how different sectors, different geographies can work together more effective. And so when the next pandemic arises, we won't be starting from scratch. Again, we will be building on a strong foundation and a common understanding.
Thanks for that, Mark. And Derrick, let me turn it over to you, and then I'm going to ask an even more challenging question. Derrick.
I think just building on that, Mark talked about reaching across the boundaries to understand each other's realities and constraints. And I think that's incredibly important. I mean, Ayman talked earlier on about how do we prepare for the future? He talked about, push and pull mechanisms, which is, trying to address market failure. And it's economics. I mean, it's about, at the end of the day, it's about sharing of resources and sharing of risk. And this is fundamentally at the heart of pandemic preparedness, is about sharing of resources and sharing of risk. And I think those push and pull mechanisms are sort of designed to do that. Now, how do we ensure the appropriate sharing of risk? What should the private sector bear? What should public sector bear? Private sector bear? What are the roles and responsibilities of each party? I think that is a difficult question. And as Mark suggested, there'll be a lot of lessons learned coming out of this. I think on a positive note, I think there have been some lessons that have been learned from the past. So, for example, the fact that COVAX exists even in this pandemic is a lesson from the H1N1 swine flu that occurred about 9 years ago, where there was no such organization. And indeed, the available vaccines at the time were very concentrated to just a number of countries. And in fact, the developing world did not receive any significant amount of vaccines for many, many months after the first vaccines were available. This time round, through COVAX and our partners, the first vaccines were delivered to Ghana approximately 6 weeks after the first vaccines were used in North America and Europe, for example. So I think the fact that we're doing things a little bit differently this time was already reflecting some of those lessons learned. I think that will create a legacy. Is it a perfect system? Are we there yet? No, clearly not. I mean, as Ayman pointed out at the beginning, we still have large discrepancies in the coverage rates of vaccination across different regions of the world. So while we've tried to address a couple of things, there's going to be lessons to be learned and applied for the next time round. I think one of the things that I want to mention is the establishment of no-fault compensation schemes that WHO and COVAX put in place, as well as indemnification of manufacturers. And that, I think, was a significant step. Manufacturers have said, as we're developing these vaccines at pace and ensuring the distribution, there's going to be limitations around the sort of warranties and guarantees we can give around these vaccines, and there needs to be an indemnification, which in the past, only the more well-resourced sovereign governments were able to provide. And this was not possible for the less resourced countries to share that risk with the private sector. Recognizing that through the multilateral, sort of setup that we have at Gavi and our alliance partners with WHO, UNICEF, and CEPI, there was a global indemnification scheme that was established, as well as a no-fault compensation scheme to protect the citizens of the developing world as well. This is new, this is novel, huge step forward, and as a recognition of the sharing of risks across the sectors. And I think this is a learning that will continue and carry forward into the next pandemic. So I think I just wanted to introduce a notion that sharing of risk and sharing responsibility, I think, is at the heart of it. And I think the conversation will continue. But, have we made progress and have we learned from 9 years ago? Yes. Is there better sharing across the sectors? Yes. Are we there yet for the next one? Not quite. And the conversation will continue.
So thank you for that. I think we have time for one last question, and it's a tough one. But so interesting. In the early days of vaccine development, distribution, production and distribution, we saw many of the pharmaceutical firms, for-profit organizations, set aside expectations around profit, engage in very generous giving. And now we're starting to see a shift towards what I would characterize as a more sustainable business model, which includes profit, and shareholders will expect that of pharmaceutical firms. So your thoughts on how we approach that balance between social responsibility and shareholder value. And it may be an inappropriate dichotomy that I presented, but your thoughts on the two, please. And maybe I'll start with Ayman, and then I'll move around.
Sure.
And you each have about a minute and a half.
All right. So I think if you're really good, they don't conflict with each other. But if you're really good, you know, and finding that balance is sort of like, for me, a hallmark of like an amazing company. You know, when I say amazing company, it's not an easy standard. There's not that many amazing companies around the world, you know, but there's some that are amazing, you know. So for me, that's kind of should be the corporate goal. It's like, because it's almost like the ultimate form of your customer satisfaction. If you can make a product, okay, and make it available under the right conditions that fit within social ethical norms, and actually push the boundary on excellence in that front, and at the same time be able to turn a profit so that you can further invest in R&D and continue your mission, that is the hallmark of corporate success for me. You know, I don't see them as things that conflict. I see them as two things that you need to focus on to achieve excellence. And that's the mindset, I think, that corporations that want to be at the forefront need to embrace. And we saw some pretty darn good examples of that in the vaccine industry. For a humble industry like we are, it's sort of very gratifying, and it gives me a lot of sort of passion to wake up in the morning and try to do my best every day. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Franz, please.
Sure. So yeah, so AstraZeneca was at a not-for-profit when with the vaccine, and I think it's, you know, those are all great points, Ayman, in terms of the ultimate panacea for a company in terms of the corporate and ethical nature of it and what you want out of it. I think there is, you know, sustainability. It comes down to what needs to go into research, what needs to go into, I mean, you know, there's so many failures that happen when you're testing and you're doing the research, and then to come up with that something's that's gonna work. So it's the balance. It's the balance. But I think when there is a pandemic, when there's a global pandemic, and that companies are showing up and you know, they're rolling up their sleeves and they're answering the need, I think that's important. And hopefully that kind of comes out after, in terms of you know, who is at the table, who do you need to bring at the table, and to deal with the pandemic, because so many other things are happening as a consequence of the pandemic. We have things that are being delayed. We have surgeries that are being canceled. We have things like that. So we need to deal with that. That's urgent. And then you keep moving on. So I don't know if I answered your question. I guess the company, I guess in the way it showed up, it answers the question. You know, it was that not-for-profit, and it continues to be. It's starting to be in some areas, but again, that speaks to the sustainability and then the ongoing research that's involved by the industry.
So that's really helpful. And clearly your shareholders understand the nature of your business, or one would hope. Mark, I will turn it to you.
Well, I mean, I think it's a complicated issue. I mean, I don't in any way disagree with the idea that a company should be able to do well by doing good. I mean, I think that is a marker of a successful company, but I think people are focusing on the companies that have actually made a lot of profit, you know, in this, you know, obviously Pfizer is the leading example where they delivered a number of innovations, both a vaccine and an antiviral drug, and are reaping significant profits. But I think and I don't have a problem with that, but what I want to highlight is that a lot of other companies got involved and will not make money on this, and actually will lose money. And what you have is, you know, as referred to earlier, there are hundreds of different vaccine candidates that different entities have been advancing. I mean, is that actually what we need to prepare for the future? There's tremendous inefficiencies and lack of coordination there, and there's competition for scarce resources and sometimes misallocation of those resources. And I don't exactly know how far we could go into a more strategic, proactive model that shared. I mean, what Derrick appropriately highlighted is, who's taking on the risk and who's trying to mitigate that risk, and how do we do that more successfully? I think we need to find a way to do better. I don't think leaving it to chance and the individual motivations of individual companies is necessarily going to be a predictable solution.
Thank you. And Derrick, you get the final word. I'll give you 3 words, 5 words.
Thank you. So firstly, I do want to acknowledge the companies that have decided to do this on a non-profit basis. I think that was a bold move and something that they considered, and I think it's very much appreciated, by the global community. Now, we recognize, as I said at the beginning, that perhaps in this pandemic, we've seen a wider diversity of manufacturers than we had before. Some of them from academia, some of them biotechs, and some of the very established players. All of them have a different business model. All of them have different expectations to their shareholders. And so I think we acknowledge that in that diversity, there will be a diversity of business models, and not everybody would be in a position to do it, for non-profit reasons. Having said that, I think what Ayman mentioned is extremely important, and that is the most successful companies, and as Mark said, doing well by doing good. It means actually building that sustainability access into the business model. And there are ways of doing it. I know I'm speaking to Rotman, and I know there are many business minds that are better than myself to think through this. But, for instance, where does global reach, volume share, for instance, that developing countries can provide through their growing populations, actually be an essential part of that business strategy around volume, for example? Where does partnerships, where does having global reach, for instance, tech transfers to expand reach and accelerate reach actually help? And that can actually help with cost of goods if sited in different parts of the world and enable access. So that can be all built in as part of that business strategy. And I think that is actually important. And I think that's the crux of it. I think each company needs to think, we recognize there's different operating models and there's different business strategies, but I think how does that company build in that access and that global reach from the get-go as part of their business strategy, I think is the heart of the question. And we've seen other things, tiered pricing models and so forth. So I think there are a whole heap of examples, and I'm sure at Rotman, you've got a business school case that have been written up. But I would like to encourage, manufacturers and developers to think that way. I think for those who can afford to do it non-profit, we salute them and we welcome that move. And I think that is laudable. But recognizing there is a diversity of approaches, which is fine. But I think at the heart of it, as we all say now, sustainability, access should be at the heart of the strategy.
I don't think we could conclude with a more apt statement about the challenges we're facing. These webinars, the success of a webinar is always hard to gauge, but I have 2 metrics. One is that the conversation can go on and on and on, but it can't. And the second is, and this is remarkable, not a single attendee left in the first 52 minutes. And I've never seen a webinar, a panelist keep an audience like that. So thank you so much for your time and for our attendees. If you enjoyed today's event, and I know you did because you're still with us, let me say that this is the final session in our webinar series, but we will be holding a talk available to all on February 15th, Evolving the Healthcare Supply Chain to Support New Models of Care. So on behalf of the Sandra Rotman Center for Health Sector Strategy, thank you, Franz, Ayman, Derrick, and Mark, and thank you all for joining us. Be well, everyone, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation.
Bye.